welcome back to episode 34 of the Bible Connection podcast. So, guys, this is a weekly podcast. It follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you to just keep on reading your Bibles this year. I know it's getting tough. We're going through these long chapters, these long books, but just bear with us. We're going to help you get through it. So, I'm your host, Josh Williams, and with me are a couple of my good friends, Brendan Stooksbury.
I can't say shalomi homie anymore.
And my good friend, John Steinke.
I really wish Taylor was here to rein him in.
Yeah, Taylor's
Me
out
too.
this week. But we're going to try to get through this. Jeremiah is pretty daunting, so we'll see how it goes. All right, this week, like I just said, we're going through Jeremiah, so let's get started. Our last episode of the podcast, we centered around our discussion of the prophet Isaiah. We discussed the historical context that Isaiah lived in, as well as his purpose in writing the book of Isaiah. So I just want to ask you guys, what's the historical context for Jeremiah? And is he before or after the time of Isaiah? And why did he write this compilation?
Well, Jeremiah is well after the time of Isaiah, in by a large margin. So just give you a big picture once again of what we're dealing with. We're in that kind of less familiar part of the Bible. We're talking about the kings of Israel and Judah. So when we mentioned Moses or Abraham or David, we're like, okay, I know what kind of time period that was. Solomon reigned and died over the United Kingdom around 1000 BC. And his son, Rehoboam, out of his unfaithfulness, caused the kingdom to divide. So you have Judah in the south and Israel in the north. And so from about 950 BC to 586 BC, that's when you have the kingdoms. Now, remember, it counts backwards because we're in the BC, right? So from 950 to 586, in the north, Israel was continually having wicked kings until they were judged and destroyed by Assyria. That happened in the days of Isaiah, around 720. Here, Jeremiah, he doesn't even get started in his ministry until 627. So even in the longest estimates of how long Isaiah was around, there's at least been 50 years where Isaiah is dead and buried before Jeremiah begins his public ministry. And that's an important distinction because the people would have heard Isaiah's warning. Isaiah was warning in a kind of, we mentioned the phrase covenant lawsuit. He was taking the people to charge for their unfaithfulness to the Torah, the law given by Moses. And they've received that warning for generations before Jeremiah comes around and gives this judgment. So that's a kind of an important distinction as we're trying to understand. When did Jeremiah live? He began during the time of Josiah. So if you flip all the way back to 2 Kings in your Bible, 2 Kings chapter 23, you get a little description of what the spiritual state of Judah was like in the time of Josiah. And it says, verse 25 of chapter 23, before him, that's Josiah, there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to the law of Moses. Nor did anyone like him arise after him. Verse 26, but still the Lord did not turn from burning his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel. And I will cast off this city that I've chosen, Jerusalem, and the house which I've said, my name shall be there. In the time of Jeremiah, the Lord has looked on the sins of Judah, and he's saying, my judgment is firm. It's coming.
No matter what Josiah is doing.
Josiah is doing right in his eyes, and he's a good king, but the wickedness, if you look back to what his father was doing, Manasseh was doing, he was burning his children alive as sacrifices to the fake god Molech. It was horrible, and it was horrible in those days. And so the Jeremiah is different than Isaiah. Isaiah came giving the warning over the people, and they received that warning. And for generations, they didn't heed it. And even in the time of, even if Josiah was a good king, it was too little, too late. Judgment is coming. And that's the kind of the context we have as Josiah comes in. Why did he write this message? The Lord is calling him as a prophet to declare that his covenant with Israel, and by Israel, I mean Judah, but the nation of Israel is now ending. They have broken covenant, and a divorce between God and Israel is about to occur.
Yeah, and something I'd like to pick up on in what you said, John. The first couple of verses, the first 3 verses of chapter 1 are setting giving us a good timestamp and kind of a historical setting, just a real condensed. But right after that, immediately, right after this, we get the call of Jeremiah, which is similar to the call of Isaiah, but we find it right off the bat, like right at the beginning of Jeremiah's book. And what's interesting is in the call of Jeremiah, we're told that Jeremiah is kind of downcast because of his youth, that he is going to be a prophet to Judah, and that he's not confident because he is a youth.
Mm-hmm. There's also a little bit more to that too. So Jeremiah is actually in the lineage of a guy named Abiathar. You can find it in 1 Kings. And Solomon actually, cast him out as head priest. Okay. You know what I mean? And like,
I actually didn't look this up.
His priesthood, like lineage, it's almost like they didn't accept it, the other priest.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So It was almost like he was already, on the back foot.
Well, he is on the back foot. And I would think that there may be an allusion here back to the beginning of Isaiah in Isaiah 1. I'm sorry, not in Isaiah 1, Isaiah 3, where one of the judgments on Judah and Jerusalem is, if you look at Isaiah 3, verse 4, and I will make boys their princes, and infants shall rule over them. And then down a little further, my people, infants are their oppressors, and women rule over them. There may be an allusion to that this nation has become so spiritually degenerate that youth. I mean, one of the great reformers of Judah's history is basically a youth when he becomes king.
Josiah, and so they're sharing the same. Yeah, they're contemporaries of one another. Yep. Here, Jeremiah is worried about being a prophet because he's so young, and meanwhile Josiah took the throne at 8 years old.
Yep.
And this is the great repenting king that we're talking about here.
Yep.
How many of the older men in Israel do you think are really taking him seriously when he's trying to renew the law?
Yeah.
Yep. And he's constantly questioning God too, like, no, I'm not ready. And we have this. I feel like a lot of people know this little excerpt right here in verse 5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. This idea that like God's got a plan for you, and just like Job, you don't get an option.
It reminds me of another passage that I'm going to bring up here in a minute. Moses saying, "Well, I can't speak very well," and he says, "Well, who formed man's tongue?"
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thought, the exact same thing the Lord's doing for Jeremiah.
Jeremiah's full of that kind of stuff. Yeah. Chapter 18. Yeah, we'll get into it. So, moving on, one thing that was mentioned last week was that Isaiah began the trend of God's prophets of executing a covenant lawsuit against Israel. So what role does Jeremiah play in that trend?
Well, okay, so I mentioned Moses. I'll go ahead and get into it. Jeremiah is like a second Moses over the people. And so some connections to kind of, make that a little bit more obvious. Jeremiah and Moses were both from the tribe of Levi. Both of them served over the body of Israel for 40 years. Both of them had a similar calling where the Lord called them out to be a prophet, and they both, because of their inability to speak, thought that they couldn't until the Lord said, "I will be with you," and kind of gave them that ability. Both of them are writing prophets, Moses writing the Torah, Jeremiah writing a very long book, and the texts that they wrote share similar literary structures. No, Jeremiah didn't write 5 different books, but if we remember back to the very first episodes of this podcast, we talked about how Moses structured the Torah in a chiasm, pointing to the very middle in Leviticus for the Day of Atonement, which basically explained how God was going to reconcile his people. And Jeremiah does the exact same thing in his structure. If you go to the very middle of the book, you'll see the new covenant explained. More than this, though, Moses led the people out of Egypt and into the promised land. Jeremiah is going to, in effect, lead them into exile and back into Egypt. And both of them died outside of the land of promise. Not even, there's just so many more things. Jeremiah is being presented in this book. He's meant to be seen as a second Moses. And the reason for that is because Moses brought the people of Israel into covenant. I'm kind of using my hand as motions as I'm talking here. He brought them into covenant with God at Mount Sinai. And Jeremiah is going to basically, you said execute a covenant lawsuit. He's prosecuting them. He's going to explain and disestablish them from that covenant because they have breached the terms of that covenant. They've been unfaithful. They've transgressed against God. And so the old covenant is being removed from them for their covenant unfaithfulness.
And picking up on what you just said, if you, the listener, would like to just look at an example of this in Jeremiah 17:1, it says, "The sin of Judah is written with a pen of iron with the point of a diamond on it, is engraved on the tablet of their heart and the horns of their altar, while their children remember their altars." The Mosaic covenant symbolically is written on tablets of stone, and it's basically saying the heart of Israel, it's taking an iron pen with a diamond point, right? Even more hard. It's even more hard than the stones of the tables of the law. So,
Okay, since the days of Moses, whenever God sent a prophet, a warning of judgment was given so that the people could turn from their sins. So why does it seem like Jeremiah is telling them destruction is coming no matter what they do?
Because destruction is coming no matter what they do. It says in Jeremiah 2:9, God is speaking, "Therefore I contend with you, declares the Lord, and with your children's children I contend." If you go on to verse 13, he says, "My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and they've hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water." Now, I know that I had to look up what a cistern was when I first read this passage a couple years ago. A cistern is basically a carved out cavern that holds water for a city.
We got to walk through one.
So, yeah, we did get to walk through one
in
Istanbul recently. Me and Josh were on a trip together. That was kind of cool.
Crazy, dude.
A cistern is important to cities because, as you'll see, we'll talk about how Jerusalem was sieged. If you run out of water, you basically just die. You have to surrender. So you need to be able to store water in your city. And the judgment that God is giving here is he's saying, I am a fountain of living water. That should sound very familiar to Christians.
Jesus.
Right? I'm a fountain of living water, and my people have rejected me to carve out a broken cistern that can't hold water. Mm-hmm. And later, Jeremiah is going to be thrown into one of these cisterns, and it's going to become pretty apparent what that means. The people of Israel have decided to reject God with their hearts and instead seek after empty, unpleasing idols. We saw that warning in the time of Isaiah, and this is a thing that comes up pretty often. I would say it even happens when you look through the Gospels, right? You see things like eternal sin or a sin with no forgiveness, and you think like, oh, what does that mean? When somebody looked at Christ, when the scribes looked at Jesus, and they said that the work that Jesus was doing in his earthly ministry was the work of Satan, they were looking at the love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness, faithfulness, the fruit of the Holy Spirit in his life, and they were calling evil good and good evil. To do that, you cannot at the same time also look to Christ and believe in him for eternal life. You are rejecting the goodness of God. And I know that I don't want to get too mixed up between the Gospels and what we're looking at here in Jeremiah, but essentially the people are doing the same thing. All of Israel has looked at the goodness that God offers, and they have rather desired their sin. And so judgment is coming on them because judgment is exactly what they are due. It's what they've stored up for themselves for their sin.
Yeah, and something we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about judgment and the destruction of God's basically promised people and land is that there's a purpose. We talked about judgment in Isaiah, and that if we just solely focus on judgment and destruction, we'll miss the point. And a key interpretive verse for the book of Jeremiah. This is absolutely, I can't stress the importance of chapter 1 verse 10. And it says, and notice every word. I would highlight, star, underline, whatever you need to do to remember this verse, because it plays out and is quoted over and over and over, sections of this throughout the entire book. And it says, and this is back in his calling, it says, "See, I have set you this day over nations and over kingdoms." And what is to be said? You know, Isaiah was told that message that he was told. This is that same type of message that Jeremiah is told: to pluck up, to break down, to destroy, to overthrow, to build, and to plant. That will help you structurally for understanding the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is coming in and he's telling of this coming judgment that is going to happen no matter what. But there's a purpose that God is going to pour out his salvation through judgment. That there is a remnant, right? The remnant in the land, right? That they are to take courage, right? That though the Lord is going to, Isaiah will talk about cutting down the brush and the trees and things like that, and that's what it's spoken of here. But at the end, it says to build and to plant. And when we get to chapter 29, they're going to be even told, even when you're taken out of Israel, when you're taken out of Jerusalem, when you're in exile, be fruitful, have families, plant crops, be faithful Christians. I'll just say it to make it easier, in the land, and model God's chesed and hemet, his covenant faithfulness and his loyal love to the nations, right? But that is going to be quoted over and over and over again in Jeremiah, and the language that Jeremiah uses when talking about this judgment and this destruction is. We were talking about this a little bit before, but if you look at chapter 3, after what John was talking about, if you look at Jeremiah 3, verse 11, this was absolutely shocking to me when I read this. I'd never caught this verse until I was reading it this week, and it says, "And the Lord said to me, Faithless Israel has shown herself more righteous than treacherous Judah." Now, if you've been trekking through with us through the podcast since the divided kingdom, especially when we were talking about Chronicles and Kings, we saw that Israel basically fell off the wagon early. I mean, it was just it was awful, and they completely abandoned faith in the Lord. But Judah, there were seasons of repentance. There were good things that so much so that one of the books just exclusively talks about Judah. But here we see at the end of this covenant lawsuit, things have gotten extremely bad, and that now Judah, the one that has been modeling this covenant faithfulness, it's gotten to the point where that Israel, as bad as they are, they're more righteous than Judah, than treacherous Judah. And John, I know you wanted to talk about that, but it gets to the point in the next chapter, in chapter 4. I mean, this is shocking language, and I would highly recommend that you don't just pass over this. Notice what is being said here in chapter 4 in verses 23 through 28. And Taylor, we wish you were here, man, because this is
His bread and butter right here.
This is Taylor's jam right here. He knows more about this than probably the three of us put together.
Pause. Before Brandon explains this, I want all of y'all to pause the video and just read Genesis chapter 1. Just get a quick refresher.
Yeah.
All right. Do that, and then
Unpause.
play the video again.
Yep. All right. So in chapter 4, verse 23, this language should sound just like what you just read in Genesis 1, because it says, "And I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void." This is what Taylor talks about.
Tohu vehu.
Exactly. Yeah. He.
That's the Hebrew. They didn't just stutter there. Okay.
Yeah. But
Taylor's gonna love when he goes back and listens to this.
he's gonna be kicking himself because he's like, "Oh, I had so much to say." But anyway, but it says, "And to the heavens they had no light, and I looked at the mountains, and behold, they were quaking, and the hills moved to and fro. And I looked, and behold, there was no man, and all the birds of the air had fled. And I looked, and behold, the fruitless land was a desert, and all its cities were laid ruined before the Lord and before his fierce anger. For thus the Lord says, the whole land shall be a desolation." Should sound like chapter 1, verse 10. "Yet I will not make a full end. For this the earth shall mourn, and the heavens above be dark. For I have spoken, and I have purposed. I have not relented, nor will I turn back." And what we should see here is this symbolic language. We shouldn't take this literally, but this is talking about the decreation, right? And John mentioned the similarities between Jeremiah and Moses. Moses is the one telling us, and he's writing Genesis and telling us that God is bringing in his creation. He's bringing order. He's bringing order out of chaos. He's creating cosmos out of chaos, as Miles Van Pelt would say. And what is happening here through the prophet Jeremiah? Jeremiah is saying, you have taken cosmos, you've taken order, and because of your unfaithfulness, you have basically decreated what the Lord is causing disaster on the land through the prophet, and through the interplay between God's sovereignty and man's responsibility here is, you need to keep that in mind. But basically the whole created order here is showing that it's symbolically is being undone through Judah's unfaithfulness. So
pushing you on the chapter 1 verse 10. You said that's how it's a good way to get our minds focused on reading Jeremiah, right? So my question is this idea of pluck up and to break down, right? Do you think that is pointing to like recognizing our sin, and then this destruction and overthrowing, and that's like the judgment that Jeremiah's talking about, and then this like build and plant is like.
So one thing about reading the prophets, and I'm interested to hear what John might have to say about this too, is I'm a little uncomfortable about making a immediate application to our personal experience, because immediately we need to see its immediate fulfillment in Israel and Judah.
I'm saying, but is that also like the broader picture of what he's trying to say to Israel? Like this is what needs to happen.
You're saying their sin.
Yes,
Yeah.
Like Jeremiah's preaching against their sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he's preaching. He says, to destroy and to overthrow. He's preaching, hey, here's judgment. It's coming, right? And like John's going to get to talk about this whole exilic motif about,
exilic motif.
Yeah.
Am I ready to talk about that?
That's my jam.
But
I think
this idea of to build and to plant.
So
like
let me give an
renewal,
example.
I guess.
Yeah, let me give an example. When we read the book of, I think that chapter 1 verse 10 is telling us to imagine take a forest, take a random forest on the side of the road that you see. It's all grown up. You see, nasty looking hedge apple trees and just bushes. You couldn't even possibly walk through it. I mean, you got sawbriars and things like that. And you're saying you'll say, I want to put a garden there. So what do? You go in there and you start hacking trees down, and then you start removing the stumps. Then you start plowing the ground, and then after that, you're seeding, then you're taking care of the crop after that. And that's exactly how we should view what God is doing symbolically through the judgment to Israel.
Absolutely. So when you
Yeah.
look at God, like God's covenant given to Moses was a example of his faithful loving kindness all the way back to Abraham. He made the promise to Abraham that he would have children as numerous as the stars, that through him the whole world would be blessed, basically recognizing that the solution to the fall of man all the way back to the garden, where the seed would come from the woman to crush the head of the serpent, he's basically making that promise to Abraham. Through you, the whole world will be blessed. Those who bless you will be blessed. Those who curse you will be cursed. And your people will fill the earth, as it was called back in creation. And so when this people, this descendants of Abraham, when they break covenant, when they transgress, it's so much more severe. Going back to chapter 3, where it says, faithless Israel shown more righteous than treacherous Judah. It's so much more severe because of that deep, loving connection. God's desire isn't ultimately judgment. It's like Brandon's saying. He's trying to clear out so that the garden can be built from the wilderness. And so that wasn't Eden imagery, by the way. I'm just talking about like Brandon's metaphor. So when we talk about what's going on, there are plenty of passages in Jeremiah that kind of emphasize what we mean when we say that judgment is coming. It's too little, too late. You can go to chapter 7 in verse 21 through 26. It says in verse 23, "But this command I gave them, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk in the way I command you, that it may be well with you." What happened? They did not obey or incline their ear, but walked in their own counsels and stubbornness of their evil hearts, and went backwards, not forwards. I persistently sent all my servants as prophets to them day after day, yet they didn't listen to me. So it's not that the Lord doesn't give chance to relent or repent, or to turn from their sin. It's that the time for judgment is now here. You can see more of this in kind of an understanding of what it means that the covenant was broken in chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse starting in 10, "They turned back to the iniquities of their forefathers who refused to hear my words. They've gone after other gods to serve them. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken my covenant that I made with their fathers. Therefore, says the Lord, I'm bringing disaster upon them, that they cannot escape. Though they cry to me, I will not listen to them." And ultimately, he's doing this in the context of what's been preached to them. So we were in the Psalter recently, right? We're in the book of Psalms. The very first psalm is something we just talked about in Sunday school recently here at Beaver Dam. "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water." Well, as that image is in your brain, go to chapter 17 and see what Jeremiah says. He says, "Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He's like a tree planted by the water that sends its roots into the stream." So you should be thinking, okay, the same picture that's going on in Psalm 1, but how does it continue? "He does not fear when the heat comes, its leaf remains green, and it's not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit." That's the man who trusts in the Lord. But verse 9, "The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his deeds." So that wisdom given the beginning of the Psalter, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked." Judah has walked in the counsel of the wicked, who stands not in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. They are standing in the way of sinners and sitting in the seat of scoffers. And ultimately, like the ironic part, you get out of this, there's a lot of strange images given in the first part of Jeremiah. You'll notice when you do reading plan, we're not talking about the underwear that was soiled. That's just not what we're talking about, because frankly, it's a little weird. But when we get to chapter 21, you get straight into historical prose again, which is a fancy way of saying it's just telling the story again. And basically, the king sent for the prophets and were like, "So is God going to help us with Babylon?" After Jeremiah's been preaching all of this stuff, the king doesn't get it. He's like, "So is the king going to help us with Babylon? Is God going to help us with Babylon?" And God's like, "No. Mm-hmm. No, your swords, I'm going to make just turn to dust in your hands. You're going to be crushed. Babylon will destroy you." And so the covenant has been broken and judgment is coming. And so all of the protection and love and covenant keeping that the Lord has had over Israel would no longer be loving to keep that over them if they're going to live this way. With that same metaphor, Israel was faithless, but Judah was still worse because it was treacherous. One of the things we said before we hit record on the podcast, imagine if a stranger came up to you and said, "I hate you," or "I don't care about you." Hopefully, most of us would have a thick enough skin to go, "Okay, that was hateful," right? And then your little girl comes up to you and says, "I hate you and I don't care about you." It cuts deep. It cuts very deep. And so what's going on is, because of this breach of covenant, because they've transgressed against that close relationship, the judgment on them is going to be all the more severe. Is that making sense?
Mm. All right, so after reading Isaiah and now Jeremiah, it is clear that the Lord's plan was to usher in a new covenant with Israel. So what I kind of wanted you guys to kind of expound on was, what was the old covenant? Why did it fail? And let's talk about this new covenant.
Yeah,
in 31.
Yeah, the old covenant. When we talk about the old covenant, that's a New Testament. The New Testament calls it that, especially in the book of Hebrews. But the old covenant, technically, a lot of times when we think of that, we think of the Mosaic covenant. But what we need to realize with the Mosaic covenant is rooted in, if you read the beginning of Exodus, where the Mosaic covenant, the Ten Commandments, and what follows from there, the foundation of the Mosaic covenant is the Abrahamic covenant. The reason that the Lord is hearing his cry of the people in slavery in Egypt is because he remembered his covenant with Abraham. And so the old covenant, we talked about this before, but we should see the covenantal progression throughout the scriptures as like a staircase, right? They're all connected. There's this one staircase, and the steps are progressively, step by step, stepping forward and up. And that's how we should see the progression of the steps. We don't need to see them as disconnected covenants, but all linking together, right? So when we think about the old covenant, technically we're thinking of the Mosaic covenant and its relationship to Israel, right? And so there is some progression in that. We see that the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant, still has as it progresses into the Davidic covenant, there is still Israel is still commended for its keeping of the Mosaic covenant within David's time and afterwards, and it's also judged for its covenant unfaithfulness for in David's time and after. But when we think about the new covenant, we find that unfolding in passages like what we talked about last time in Isaiah 54, Isaiah's covenant of peace. And then also we see the language of the new covenant. We're probably most familiar with the language of the new covenant from Jeremiah, because one of the reasons is because the book of Hebrews, the longest quotation of the Old Testament is found in Hebrews 8. And Hebrews 8 is quoting actually the Septuagint version of Jeremiah 31, and it begins Jeremiah 31 and 31. Behold, the days are coming when I declares the Lord, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So
Both.
Yep. So the kingdom now is we should see it as coming back together. The exile is over, right? And the nations are coming back together. Not like a covenant that I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand out of the land of Egypt. My covenant they broke. Jeremiah is talking about this covenant breaking, this divorce that happens between Israel and Yahweh, Right, that's what's being spoken of here. And the difference is that the new covenant, the Lord is promising that this is never going to happen in the new covenant. The new covenant is not going to be he is never going to break his covenant with the new Israel, the church. It's never going to happen. Why is that never going to happen? I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people, which is Leviticus language. But look where the law is. The law is no longer external. The law is no longer contained within the ark, within the tabernacle, or within the temple. The language that Jeremiah is using here is shocking, because what he's saying here is that the Ten Commandments that we're familiar with, that's now our heart. Mm-hmm. Jeremiah is saying that the new covenant is that the law has gone from the outside, and now it's written on our heart. And the language of heart in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, we shouldn't think of as the that red heart-shaped thing in our chest, you know what I'm saying, that pumps blood throughout our body. Right? That's the word that's used, but that's not the idea that's being put across here. And I wish Taylor was here, because I'm sure he has some good stuff to say about this. You're gonna say something, John? But it's controlling, it's affecting from the top of our head to the soles of our feet, the inclinations, the motivations of who we are. The law is within us, working that out to all the way to our fingertips. So the law is within us now. It's no longer external, it's within us. Right? And that what's the even more shocking analogy is that there's the law was contained in the ark. The new ark is us, the church. We are the new ark. And where is this new ark at? It's going throughout the entire world, right? And eventually, right, the motivation for the traveling tabernacle going throughout the world, modeling, it was like a little garden, right? But then it comes to Jerusalem and it's bigger, right? Well, now it's within the church, right? And it's spreading throughout the entire world, so that eventually the entire world will be like a gigantic ark, right? It will be like a gigantic temple garden. And we see that at the end of the book of Revelation. So I could keep going on this, but I'm sure you got...
So in kind of a more succinct way of looking at this, we have the Old Covenant was kind of inaugurated in Exodus 19, where he said, and this is the Lord saying to the people, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my commandment, you shall be my treasured possession, for all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And again, he emphasizes, these are the words you shall speak to the people of Israel. And so how did the old covenant fail? Not God. The people failed. Mm-hmm. As Brandon just read, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant they broke." So the issue that happened with the old covenant wasn't that the law was wrong. It was that the people failed to keep it. And in fact, we've seen since the time of Noah, and really since the time of the garden, the hearts of mankind are continually evil and are after sin. And so what's the solution to this? You can go to Jeremiah chapter 32. "Now therefore," verse 36, "says the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning the city which you say, it's been given to the king of Babylon by the sword and the famine and the pestilence. Behold, I will gather them from all the countries to which I drove them in my anger and my wrath in great indignation. I will bring them back to this place, and I will make them dwell in safety. They shall be my people, and I will be their God." There's no "if you will obey." It's "they shall be my people, I will be their God, because I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever. For their own good and the good of their children after them, I will make them an everlasting covenant. I will not turn away from them to doing good. I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. I will rejoice in doing them good. I will plant them in the land of faithfulness with all my heart and all my soul. The difference between the old covenant and the new covenant is the inward working miracle that God will work on his people. And it's going to be completely different than what happened before, because he's going to, if you go back to Proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Mm-hmm. He's going to put that fear right into the hearts of his people.
Yeah, and another emphasis on the difference between the old covenant and the new. The old covenant was a come see type, not absolutely exclusively, because there was going out, but by and large it was come to the temple, right? Come to the altar, right? And so much so that there were provisions in the Tanakh that, or the Torah, for the people to come. But what's interesting is we see scattered out throughout Jeremiah passages like chapter 16, verse 16, and this should sound really familiar. Behold, I'm sending out many fishermen, declares the Lord. They shall catch them, and afterwards I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt from them from every mountain and every hill, and from the cleft of the rocks. What is being spoken of here is the restoration of Israel, the church, the new covenant. Jesus picks up on this. And when he's calling his disciples, and he says, basically lay down your nets. I'm calling you to be fishers of men. When he was calling Peter and was it Andrew there, immediately they would have been thinking, oh my goodness, this is the restoration of Israel. And that's even the question that people have: when will you restore Israel? Because they're thinking in these categories, right? But they misunderstand. They misunderstand covenantally what Jesus is doing, because he's not working with ethnic Israel. He's working with the nations now. He's saying,
and the realization that Peter has when he witnesses to Cornelius too.
Yeah,
I feel like I'd love to see his face when it all makes sense to him.
Yeah, and you see in where is it at? Had it in my, is it chapter? He's talking about fig trees. Jesus.
My brain says chapter 19, but I could be guessing.
Is it chapter 19?
I think it's.
I've got so many. If you could see my fingers in my Bible, there's so much stuff that we want to talk about, but
Just had it.
Oh, it's chapter 24.
24.
It's after he talks about the branch.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the potter and the branch and the figs and the loincloth and he gives so many different, they're not object lessons, but like metaphors.
Yeah.
The tree planted by streams of water.
Oh yeah.
The famine. He's depicting in prophecy these pictures to help them see what's going on in God's plan around them.
Yeah, and we should. And what I was going to say about the fig tree in chapter 24 is that there's this, and with Jeremiah, there's these parables and then explanations, just like Jesus does, right? So you see that over and over in Jeremiah, but in 24 he talks about there's this vision of good figs and bad figs, and he talks about the good figs are the remnant and the restoration, and that's what Jesus is talking about when he curses the fig tree in his own ministry. The fig is bearing leaves, but it has no fruit. That's Israel, right? Israel is there claiming to be the with all of the lookings of what the covenant people should look like, but their faithfulness isn't there. They're not producing fruit, right? And this is what Jesus is alluding to, and that's the reason he curses the fig tree. It's actually a bad tree, and Israel is that at the time of Jesus' ministry is that bad fig tree, and he curses them. And then I think in 70 AD, judgment comes upon again on Israel. So
one of the things we're basically telling you as you read Jeremiah is recognize that this is not just an isolated Jeremiah's got his warning of judgment on Judah, but it has nothing to do with your understanding of Christ and has nothing to do with your understanding of the new covenant. Jeremiah is quoted consistently throughout the Gospels and throughout the New Testament because what's happening here in the time of Judah is extremely relevant to what happened in Christ's day and is happening in your lifetime. And so as you're reading these, why do I got to read this story about fig trees? Soak it in. Things don't have to be immediately applicable to your life today to be applicable to your life in times of need. And so soak it in, treasure it in your heart, ponder on it, think like Mary, right? Because the Lord is going to reveal these things to you as you're reading through the New Testament.
Yeah.
All right, so as we continue to read the prophets, it is becoming clear how we are to read and interpret God's judgment over his people. But what are we supposed to do when we read about his judgment over the foreign nations? Like, how can we learn from these passages today?
Well, we're at the 45-minute mark here in this episode. And so me and Brandon would love to, take the time throughout the week to study each individual one super in depth and give you all the nuance, but that's not why a lot of you are coming here. So what I want to emphasize as you're reading, how do I draw from this judgment on foreign nations? When we looked at the new covenant, we just said that the new covenant is going to include people from not ethnic Israel and Judah, but even the nations they're going to be drawn from, and their heart would have God's law written onto it. So that might lead you to assume, well, then judgment doesn't need to take place anymore. All the people of the world are about to have God's law written on their heart, but that's not what's going on. The nations, the wicked nations, are still going to be judged even after this new covenant is promised, because the iniquity of the people, a simpler way to put that, the sin that they've committed is still evil in God's eyes. God still judges sin. Judgment is a continuing good aspect of God's character and plan in creation. And we don't need to confuse the fact that God is going to act in grace and mercy and an inward miracle of new birth in the hearts of people. We'll talk about that new birth a little bit as we get to Ezekiel in the next episode. We don't need to confuse that fact with this idea of universalism that says that there's no judgment anymore and that after the destruction of Jerusalem, that there's no judgment and for the people of God or for anybody in the world, because judgment still falls on the wicked and those who oppress the needy, and the Lord is just in that action.
Yeah, and what we need to really consider when we're thinking of the Lord pouring out his judgment on these nations that have come to judge Israel, yes, they are absolutely doing what the Lord had predestined for them to do. That is his hand that he's rising up. Right? We've heard in Exodus, for this very reason, it's Romans. For this very reason, Pharaoh was raised up. Right? Pharaoh was wicked and evil, and but the Lord was using that. Right, and that was his plan. Didn't take him by surprise. From before the foundation of the world, that's what God had planned to take place. But just because the Lord is using these Gentile nations to judge Israel, right, doesn't mean that they're, like what you were saying, getting off scot-free, because you'll read in Isaiah, because of their haughtiness of heart, I'm going to judge Assyria. I'm going to judge Babylon. I'm going to judge these nations. And tying in Jonah, with Nineveh, right? God is, there's a connection between Jonah and Jeremiah. Just it's really interesting what God did there. But anyway, we don't have time for that. But I mean, we see a microcosm of it. This in Jesus' own life, right? In Acts chapter 4, for truly in this city were gathered against your holy servant Jesus, whom you appointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. Right? So these people were in sin, right, in what they were doing to Jesus, and yet it was God's predestined hand and plan to do whatever he wanted to take place.
And so the next question you might have is like, well, why are these nations getting judged? Why these nations? And so Egypt and Babylon might sound a little familiar, but there's a lot of these other names that, maybe you should put a few sparks in your brain and remember back to other passages in the Old Testament. We have the Egyptians, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites. Those are all different tribes that were oppressing and warring against Israel all the way back to the time of the Judges. And now you also see some cities, Damascus, Kedar, Hatzor. These are cities that are obviously rejecting their duty to stand up and fight with their brothers, and instead are oppressing them and becoming a thorn in their side. And so the Lord is historically in a given moment judging real people for the real sins that they've committed against his people. And so, like Brandon was saying, just because God's using them in judging this nation doesn't mean that they can, get scot-free for their sins.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but, we talked Brandon, you talked about in the beginning about chapter 1, verse 10, where God says, see, I have set you this day over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up, break down, destroy, overthrow, build, and plant. Like this idea of not only does Israel and Judah need to be renewed in this judgment, but so do all the other nations. That's who Jeremiah's been put in charge over, to pluck up, to overtake. Right.
So if this garden's going to be planted, a forest needs to be cleared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's full circle, baby. Yeah. All right, finishing up, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple were the darkest moments in the history of Israel. Is there any hope or bright spot in the midst of all the darkness as Jeremiah ends?
Absolutely. So I would ask you to look at Jeremiah chapter 52, and it's dark. It's rough at the end of Jeremiah, but right at the very end, there's this glimmer of hope. And this glimmer of hope may look strange if you're not familiar with 2 Samuel chapter 7 and the absolute centrality of that to reading the rest of the scriptures. Because in Jeremiah 52, starting halfway or at the end of verse 31, it said, Jehoiachin, king of Judah, brought him out of prison, and he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings that were in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table, and for his allowance, a regular allowance was given to him by the king according to his daily needs until the day of his death, as long as he lived. So as you read this, you may think, I've read something similar to this before. And you would be thinking of Mephibosheth, right? Mephibosheth was a son of Jonathan, Saul's son. So Saul's grandson in the life of David. David totally could have, this man was lame. He couldn't walk, and he was carried to David's table. And the man who could have rightly, in the eyes of the people, taken David's place. David is trusting in Yahweh, that Yahweh is going to, that his king, he is firmly seated in God's promises. David is providing and showing kindness, showing chesed and hemet. He's showing covenant faithfulness to this man, in which he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to do this to Mephibosheth. And God is preserving this Davidic king, and this man's journey isn't pretty, right? But the Lord is showing covenant faithfulness to this man and preserving him in Babylon, right? And
in case you missed it, Jehoiachin is a descendant of David. Yeah. He's one of the last surviving kings of Judah that comes from the line of David. And so that's why this is significant too. It's not just some random person that's being preserved this way. This, as you're saying, is God's basically what David did for Mephibosheth, God is doing for Jehoiachin in exile. Mm-hmm. He's putting him at the table the same way. And the name kind of is pronounced differently and spelled differently sometimes, but if you go to the book of Matthew, when you look at the genealogy where Christ came from, this same Jehoiachin is Jeconiah, which the Chronicles calls him Jeconiah, and Jeconiah is the ancestor by which Christ comes. And so it's not just some arbitrary connection to David that there's a glimmer of hope. Historically, this is the hope through which Christ hailed from.
Yeah, and that picks up on, we've, like you said, Josh, we've come full circle. One of the last things that's said in chapter 1, verse 10, to build and to plant, right? The seed of the woman is continuing on, right? And nothing is going to stop God's covenant faithfulness, even ugly situations, but the seed of the woman is still carrying on. So we can trust in God's covenant faithful to us as well. So.
All right, that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Bible Connection podcast. I know this was a really long one, guys, but I just want to say thank you so much to take the time to listen to this every week. We're just hoping this podcast equips and encourages you as you read. And if you would, leave a comment on YouTube. I know there's got to be questions about Jeremiah.
Smash that like button.
Oh, no. Hit that notification bell. Oh, that cracks me up. Okay. But there's also an email on screen if you want to send us questions with some anonymity. But anyways, I just hope you guys have a blessed day, and we'll be back with episode 35.
Shalom, me homie.